Distinguished guests and viewers, Wacana English edition is back, and I'm Jessie Chahal. This is, of course, an edition that is special as we have a very interesting panel joining us today. We're taking you on yet another episode of the show that gives our international and English-speaking viewers insights into political, economic, and the social landscape of Malaysia. In tonight's episode, as we enter the fourth quarter of 2024, we take a tackle at a critical issue that affects every Malaysian, you and I, the security and management of our national savings and pension funds. Now, Malaysia stands at a crossroad at this point, with over 1.1 trillion ringgit in the EPF, or the Employees Provident Fund, and about 134 billion ringgit in Khazanah Nasional. Our nation's financial reserves are, of course, substantial. Yet, recent proposals to utilize EPF funds for national development projects have sparked intense debate about the future of our retirement security and our economic stability. As we face, of course, we look at some stats. Projections are showing that 20% of Malaysians will be over the age of 60 by the year 2040. And of course, the rising living of costs that has pushed household debt up to 81.3% of GDP. The stakes at this point could not be higher. The decisions that we make today about our national savings will echo for generations to come. Of course, joining me on our panel today are three distinguished experts to help us navigate this pretty complex landscape through the lens of strategy, policy, finance, and economy. Now, first up, joining us today is former CIMB Group Holdings Berhad Chairman Tan Sri Nazir Razak, Howard Lee Chuan Hao, Ipoh Timur MP, as well as Universiti Malaya Honorary Professor Dr. Edmund Terence Gomez. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for being here. We, of course, aim to have an interactive discussion. I know each of you have come here with your perspective and your opinion, but tonight's discussion just goes beyond stats and numbers. It actually really touches or questions the fundamentals about governance and responsibility, and about the social contract between a government and its citizens. So we'll get started. Firstly, let's clear things up. What is Malaysia's investment strategy? What is the role of the GLICs?
Let's start by first talking about the GLICs, government-linked investment companies. We have what we call a GLC, government-linked companies ecosystem. And at the apex of this ecosystem sits the cabinet. And the cabinet controls, at the next layer, government-linked investment companies, which in turn then controls the government-linked companies. So the GLICs is what we are here to discuss, that second layer. And they comprise, according to the government, 7 institutions. Minister of Finance Incorporated, which is the government's holding company. Khazanah Nasional, which is our one and only sovereign wealth fund. And then we have a few pension funds. The EPF is a pension fund for the private sector employees. We have KWOP, the pension fund for government employees. We have LTAT, which is the pension fund for the armed forces. And then we have another type of institution called the Tabung Haji. The Tabung Haji is the Pilgrim Fund. Now, Khazanah is tax funded. Khazanah is a company. We also have one more institution, PNB. PNB is basically an investment fund created in 1978 to try and acquire equity and redistribute it for the Bumiputras. Khazanah was set up more recently in the 1990s. It's a sovereign wealth fund that's tax funded. The others, apart from MOF Inc., are all pension funds, which means the money comes from the public. They're public savings. And that's a fundamental difference. So Khazanah is funded by the government. The rest, the money comes from the public. So what we are here to debate today is this. The government has come up with an agenda called Gear Up, where they want to use public savings, the institutions which are seen as public savings institutions and the funds from them, to invest in the economy in what can be seen as risky sectors. That traditionally is the role of Khazanah, and that's the debate we want to get into today.
But at this juncture, would each of you say that the roles and responsibilities, the terms of reference, are clear enough to distinguish the functionality of each of these institutions? Is it clear?
Can I just add to what Terence was saying? 2 points. One is, in terms of Khazanah's funding, Khazanah was basically set up with government assets put into Khazanah, the company. So it's the returns from those investments that funds Khazanah's operations, not exactly the tax. In fact, Khazanah pays dividends to the government. Secondly, in terms of all these GLICs, Cabinet is, of course, at the helm, but each entity is governed by its own board of directors with fiduciary responsibilities to make sure that every decision is in the best interest of those entities. Yeah. So there is the checks and balances there, the governance structures there that should protect these entities from, doing the wrong things. Whether they work or not is a separate thing, but that is how it's structured.
Prof, I see you nodding there a little bit, but Howard, I'm coming to you now.
I think I need to add a little bit because I think that the way Prof put it, correct, but I think there needs to be a bit more depth in it. Difference between QAP and KWSP, or EPF as we call it, they're both pension funds, but they're very different pension funds. There's something called basically defined contribution. The other one is defined benefit, whereby the defined benefit is where you pay, basically the money gets into a pool, it gets paid across the board equally in accordance to the terms that has been agreed. Whereas the defined contribution is where however much you contribute is what you save as an individual account. So they're two separate models, though both are pension funds.
Right. So the question arises, based on the information from the Finance Ministry's press release, it says that these investments or proposed investments are seen as vital for national interests. Why then is the government looking to a retirement fund like EPF for investment when the likes of Khazanah was already established specifically for these things?
Just before Howard spoke, you looked at me and you asked me why I was smiling about something that Nazir just said. I was smiling because here we are talking about, you raised it, Jesse, the issue of governance and checks and balances. Now, at the apex, as I said, is the cabinet. Frankly, these institutions are ultimately controlled by the Minister of Finance. And now we also have a problem of the Prime Minister being the Minister of Finance. And that raises questions about checks and balances. Second, Nazir is right. There are governors, there are directors for these institutions. The question also is the transparency and accountability in the processes through which these governors are appointed. And even if it is done openly, the level of autonomy that they have, I would question that. I've raised this many times. I do question the level of autonomy they have because of the level of concentration of power in the office of the executive arm of government. So this is something, in fact, maybe Nazir may know more of because I am an outsider looking in. Nazir has more experience. But this is something we have to get into before we get into your point about how the government is now going to use these funds to invest in risky sectors of the economy.
But can I just jump in there? Yes, there seems to be a kind of reinvigoration, or I use reinvigoration of this drive to use these sovereign wealth fund and then pension funds on public infrastructure or similar investment. But it's not something new. I mean, take Plus, for example, the North-South Highway. It's what, 51% Khazanah, 49% EPF. It's for public infrastructure, public good, of which I think we all feel it's infrastructural and public good that it serves. Yes, you have to pay toll on it, but it is a public good that is generating returns, I think, on a regular basis, in a very fair and good manner for these funds. So I think it's, I would use the word, is a reinvigoration of the same spirit of which when Khazanah and EPF invested in Plus as a public good and public infrastructure investment.
But still based on that, there must be some level of transparency. So let's address that, Nazir.
No, I mean, if you look at the history of our GLICs, there is a checkered past.
Yes.
But
to say the least.
It's not correct to say that they were all had checkered past. If you look at Khazanah, it's had a sterling record. If you look at EPF, they've had sterling records, but obviously if you look at 1MDB, it's been a disastrous record. And there are many in between. The key thing is, were these organizations properly governed? Were they populated by the right boards? Were the internal processes properly adhered to? I think that's what it comes down to. And so when I look at the Gear Up plan, 120 billion was kind of a number that the finance ministry said that they intend to invest in the domestic economy. I don't have a big issue with that, because I think every investment will have to go through the proper filters, right? They will have to go through the investment committees in these organizations and then the boards in these
Are you
organizations.
convinced that this 120 billion is secured and safe to be reinvested?
No,
and will
ultimately
remain?
it depends on what you invest in, right? And if you look at the breakdown, they have basically said these GLICs will go into, will look in detail at possible investments in these sectors. So they've gone in and said, look, EPF will look at pension and healthcare. Khazanah will look at the semiconductor ecosystem. So there's some specialization between them.
Right.
And to me, EPF will go into healthcare, look at investment opportunities, and if it then passes the test in terms of ROIs that they need, then they'll go ahead. If it doesn't, then they shouldn't.
So Tansri, you say that there is transparency, it is structured enough, and there are areas in which these institutions will focus on. Prof, you're giving me the look again. I'm not too sure what's going through your mind here, but I do not think you're
He
quite
likes looking at you,
convinced with
that's it.
this transparency.
My primary concern is this: where does the power lie? Is the power equitably distributed? Unfortunately, it is not. The power is concentrated in the office of the Minister of Finance. That is the fact. I will differ with Nazir
You're saying
on
there's one person whose foot is on the gear.
who can decide. The check and balance actually would have been if the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister are separate. There's some check and balance at least in Cabinet, but that does not exist. And that's, to my mind, a red flag. I would beg to differ with Nazir in the sense that my primary concern, honestly, is EPF and KWAP, because these are the pension funds. EPF has been mired in numerous scandals. We had, going back to the 1980s, the Makuasa Maminco scandal. We have more recently had the PFI, Private Finance Initiative, a public policy to get the private sector to co-fund, public-private partnerships, to co-fund projects. But ultimately, all the money came from EPF and KWAP, when they were not supposed to fund it. We have written on this, the PFI scandal. Not enough attention has been brought to this. Now, in the Gear Up, we are coming up with a policy where we are saying EPF, KWAP, and the others can go and invest in strategic sectors. Fine, we can discuss that, and I really want to get into that. But at the same time, these are high-risk investments. Do we take our savings funds meant for people in their old age, and we know now we have an aging population, and we know now that what is already in the funds is insufficient for this aging population. These are serious problems we have to discuss. Do we risk that money now in these risky ventures when that is not their role?
Prof, can I just ask you a question here, and this is purely for my own clarification. How would you determine something or an investment is high risk, medium risk, low risk? In this particular context.
Let's come back to what Nazir just said, and he said it well. When Anwar introduced the Gear Up agenda, he also clearly specified strategic sectors in which each of these institutions would get into. Now, the first question we have to answer is that their role to get into these sectors? Because these sectors that we are talking about, let's put this in context. When they were formed, as I said, in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. That's a different time. Today, we are looking at an economy where the economy is evolving very fast. We are looking at an economy where we talked about semiconductors industries, we talked about green energy, we talked about high technology. We are talking about the way in which the economy is moving very quickly, and we have to move with the times.
In which some of these are very high return areas.
High returns and high risk. That is the point.
Question is,
Well,
what is our risk appetite?
This is where I want to go into. High risk, yes, conventional wisdom, high return means high risk. But the risk profile of any specific investment is down to what is done, how it's done, how it's diversified in terms of who invests and how much it is, right? So I don't think we can just basically say that area is high risk.
Wrong.
Just as simple as
I'm
that.
sorry,
It's not as
Howard.
simple as that, right?
That's wrong. Because when we look at the pension funds, they were not supposed to go into high risk. They're actually going to low risk.
Exactly.
And now we're going into high risk.
But
it's a fundamental shift.
Let's say, for example, equities for a private investor, for
Yes.
someone retail investor like me who dabble in the odd share here and there. Me buying one share, one counter valuing at 1,000 ringgit is very different from someone who's buying 1,000 ringgits worth of share, but from 100 different counters. For venture capital, you have to have some, depending on the size of fund, you have to have 500 different counters as a portfolio. Whereas you're buying the same value as a retail investor as one. So that actually changes the risk profile of that particular transaction, right?
You can't look at it from that perspective.
I beg to differ. I think you must, because you're talking about ETF,
Howard.
you're talking about 1.2 trillion worth of portfolio,
Howard.
right?
There's a difference between investing in low-risk equity investments and going and investing in a particular sector. Let's take EPF. EPF is going into the health sector. Very clear. EPF is going into a sector which they are trying to bring in private healthcare. Those are debatable issues in its own right. Let's look at Khazanah. Khazanah is going into energy transition. That's also a big debate, the green energy. Let's talk about PNB, new industrial parks, automation, smart agriculture. They are very specific, and all these involve high technology, new forms of innovation, R&D which is very expensive, and
I'm
R&D
gonna
which
jump
can go
in
wrong.
Just to interrupt and stop you there, and to get an insight or opinion.
No,
from
I think,
Nazir.
where I beg to differ with Prof is that this presumption that these are going to be high risk just because it's healthcare, because there's a sector, there's the deal itself, right? So if you look at every deal, the professionals will have to come in and package it in a way that is gives the risk return that the EPF wants in that case. If you look at, coincidentally, if Prof brought up the PFI, I actually think EPF had a checkered past in the 80s. Since then, it's had a very good ride. PFI is maybe an issue, but so far as EPF is concerned, it's government guaranteed. So from an investment standpoint, it's low risk to EPF.
Yeah.
Right? So if you do a healthcare deal, it may be a startup. If there's a promoter, he comes in and puts in collateral. EPF puts in capital. If they package it correctly, banks may come in with guarantees. Then suddenly, it's not a high risk investment. So I think we cannot assume that just because it's in a sector, it's high risk.
Prof, why are you assuming that these would be high
This is
risk?
where the details become important.
Yeah, and we don't have the
We
details.
don't have the details, that's the point.
And we need to basically rely on the boards and the professionals to basically make sure that every time they invest,
The board
they
and
kick the tires
professionals,
on the
when you
assumptions.
put up a red flag to say that this has basically been driven or been instructed by one person, by one entity.
No,
How do we deal with that?
The point here is this: the government can come up with a policy, recommend a gear. They can say that's what they're going to do. Fine, but the devil is in the details. Okay, you said this sector. Okay, you're going to industrial parks. You're going to green energy. Fine, but please tell me exactly how you're going to do it. Who are the co-investors? Is it going to be a public-private partnership? Those are the details we are looking into.
Which will come later.
And I think there is a point of agreement here. I believe, yes, there is a degree of opacity here that needs to be made a little bit more transparent. I agree here. I think we can agree there. But what I can't agree, it is again a matter of detail. When Prof, you mentioned that equities is high risk, right? But when something, or let's say investment in equity, which if I'm not mistaken, at least last year in 2023, 43% of the entire EPF portfolio went into equities, but it generated 61% of the entire distributable returns. versus 46% of the portfolio who went into something that is less risky, as we retail investors know, it actually brought only 33%.
Gentlemen,
Now, when it has a history of high return, because of the scale in which you can diversify at that scale, it renders it low risk or at least medium risk, in my opinion.
I'm putting this question forward to the panel. Is the government, in your opinion, behaving in an irresponsible manner with our funds? And do they have a short-term vision?
No, I disagree with
Absolutely
that.
no.
Absolutely not, Prof.
So let's get into this discussion about high risk, low risk. And let's put this in the context of the institutions that are going to be employed here.
Prof, yes or no question?
No, I think this is high risk. And I would like to explain why I have a differing view from my co-panelists.
So both gentlemen have said they believe no.
Yes.
But Prof, you've chosen
So-
a path that says yes. We will need to take a short break at this point.
Oh, nice.
Well,
That's a very good place. Catch up
There's a
over.
cliffhanger there.
This is like a soap opera.
However, there is still too early to understand the long-term effect of this boycott. When this boycott happens, it opens the door for our local coffee competitor to jump in and to establish their presence inside the industry.
It might involve me, you and some other people in the footage, right? So explaining more on that, Merce Anton and Chen's senior partner, Alex Antonetto, shares his opinion. He said several countries have mandated them. Perhaps Malaysia should follow the suit. Alex suggests that Malaysia could take cues from these nations and explore similar regulations to ensure the widespread adoption of dashcams for an enhanced road safety and legal clarity.
People who bring such criminal acts into sports. Sports is sports. Sports is not about crime. It's a test of your ability to overcome your physical weakness and all that. But winning is good, of course, but you must win because of your ability, not because you have paralyzed the opposition or done something.
Transparent and truthful. You're watching the Wacana English edition. I'm Jessie Chahal, sitting with my panel of experts who are weighing into the question that we posted just before the break. Is the government behaving in an irresponsible manner with our funds, our retirement funds, and their short-term vision? Prof, you said yes, they are. Tan Sri and Howard, both of you answered no. We're going to get into those reasons and answers right now before we go into the role of Khazanah and if they're having a mission drift, Prof.
Now, the definition of high risk has only been discussed from the perspective of equity investments.
Debated.
I want to take it to another perspective. A big debate that has been going on in Malaysia is about GLIC or GLC reforms. And we've been calling for these reforms ever since the 1MDB scandal broke. That was a big issue. After that, we had the Tabung Haji scandal. We had numerous scandals. But there has been no attempt by this government or any of the previous governments to reform the GLIC ecosystem. Now, how can we say there's no high risk when we know there's concentration of power? We know the system has been abused phenomenally. It has led to serious scandals, monumental scandals. How can we sit here and say no risk when there has been no attempt to clean up that system and make it open, transparent, and accountable? That's my first point. Let's take it to the second level. Don't talk about policies in isolation. This government at the same time came up with their Bumiputra Economic Transformation Plan 2035, what is known as the Putra 35. Nazir and I have had lots of discussions about the new economic policy, about what we call the Bumiputra policy. about redistribution of wealth. The first 10 years, as I told Nazir repeatedly, during his father's administration, it was well run. And then it changed. The perspective changed from supporting institutions, the larger populace, to supporting individuals. That was a monumental shift. If we look at the results of the NEP in terms of its primary goal of redistributing wealth, it has not achieved that. If you look at its goal of trying to create Bumiputra capitalists, it has not achieved that. If you read the Gear Up policy, it clearly stipulates that they want to help develop Bumiputra capital too. And this is where I say, now this is high risk. If you know it failed in the past, why are you still putting that as part of the Gear Up?
Tan Sri, you're tight-lipped. Please give us an explanation. You say it's low risk, Prof begs to differ.
No, I think where we agree, right, where we would agree is there is a need to look at systemic reform. You know, I wrote in my book about the three-headed monster, which is race, right, and concentration of power was one of them. Religion was the other. So concentration of power in the office of the Prime Minister is an issue. It remains an issue, right? But my argument is that some institutions have kind of weathered this or protected themselves against this. I've been in one board when I remember when I was on the board of Bank Pembangunan, we actually, on my first board meeting, I actually said, look, let us all ikrar that if we are ever told by politicians to do something we won't do, we will all resign together. And the whole board agreed. And that's where that was a good starting point for that board. And similarly, in my experience at Khazanah, I was on the board, and EPF when I was on the board, never was there a time that we took a decision which we did not, as a board, think it was in the best interest of the institutions. Now, I agree with Prof, other institutions have not fared so well. And here, I agree with him that there have been past failures which we have not properly analyzed and attributed accountability. I've seen so many situations where the failure of the GLC or whatever, and then the board says, oh, because I was instructed to by the political master, and then we accept that. That is wrong, right? Board members who basically take decisions that are against the interests of the organization, the company, is breaking their fiduciary responsibility.
So at this juncture, who should be raising those red flags? Who should be shouting from the rooftops to say that this is wrong, this is not right, this is not unanimous?
But all of us should be shouting this, because
Has that
if you
happened?
look at 1MDB today, even, right, have we really dissected it and say, okay, this was the systemic problem? Prime Minister had too much power, and people are saying, hey, actually, Prime Minister told me to do, so I do. Right? And that's wrong. Because if we don't take action at those people who said, I did it because I was told to do it, then we got a problem. I told some of the current ministers that I said we got a real problem, because next time if there's some failure at a GLC, they just say, oh, I was instructed to do it by the politician, so it's okay. Right? Actually, the guardrail is that the boards must actually say no to the politician.
At that juncture, if we go back to 1MDB, where were you in terms of raising those red flags, having seen that the power was being drifted?
You obviously need to buy my book, but you know, I covered this whole thing about raising the red flag, about going to the regulators, etc. There were major systemic failures during the 1MDB, and we should analyze and say where were the failures.
Howard?
I'd like to jump in there. Just want to pick on the fact that Prof said, not on the fact, picked on what Prof said about there is not a single thing that's been done in terms of GLIC reform. Now, I don't know about the entire Gear Up program. I don't know enough, and of course, I must stress that I'm a backbencher. I support the government. I'm not part of the government. But there is one thing that is specifically about what we mentioned earlier on, about gathering enough minds and gathering enough people and expertise to do the right thing together. I think one of the things behind it, about gathering these 6 GLICs, PNB, Tabung Haji, LTAT, Khazanah, QAP, and KWSP, is to put together and lump it together and pull and galvanize together the expertise so that there is an extra layer of galvanizing, an extra layer, or many, many layers, of making sure checks and balance happen. It's about gathering minds and galvanizing minds. So I think that's one thing that I think I would like to at least applaud. But in terms of the good work of whether or not, I'll go back to the original question of what was asked, is there a mission drift is the term. Now, Khazanah, we talked about EPF just now, let's talk about Khazanah. Last year, 600 million on Dana Impact. Right, you're talking about another 58 or 59 million specifically to Yayasan Hasanah that produced 119 what they call catalytic projects or catalytic investments. You're talking about many 29 or 30 publications that supported anything from housing right through to childcare and nutrition. So I think Khazanah, if you want to say it drifted, it actually guarded what its own turf, but perhaps it just expanded on what it wanted to do.
Expanded
or what it needs
versus
to do.
a mission drift. Tansri, you know the system inside out with your experience. For those of us who have not read the book, if you've explained this also, please expound.
Go buy it.
If you're talking about the mission drift in Khazanah, it's a strategic development fund. I wouldn't call it a sovereign wealth fund, it's a strategic development fund, so its remit is quite wide. So I don't see it as a major mission drift. In my opinion, in recent years, it's probably stepped back a little bit from strategic development. It's a bit too much of a portfolio management, but that's about it.
The term is developmental investing nowadays.
Yeah. So. But if you backtrack, Khazanah after the Asian financial crisis nationalized a lot of companies and conglomerates. Then it's increased the scale of GLICs in the system. It became almost like 30% of the stock market is owned by the government, as it were. So this I have a bit of a long-term concern, and we debated it at the time I was in the Khazanah board also. At what point will Khazanah step back? Right? At what point is the GLC mature enough to basically be sold to the private sector? Right? And I think there is an issue when you have a business sector where there are too many GLCs. Yeah, and here I would actually argue we need to go through a reform process of the GLCs. We need to be very clear what are strategic GLCs, which we need to be in.
Right.
What are GICs, which are called government investee companies. Those are companies like CIMB, Maybank, but the government is actually just a shareholder, right? Just like any other shareholder. And the only reason the government is there is because there's not enough private sector capital, right, to own those banks, etc. But the government should not get involved in it in any way. The government shouldn't dictate who's the CEO, who's the board member. And then there should be the third category, which is the kind of policy institutions like Bank Pembangunan, SCDCs, and a fourth category, which is if you're not in the first three, then you should be sold.
Then you should be
Sold.
Right. A lot to debate on this area, but we do not have much time, so I've got to move on. Now, given that in 2040, approximately 20% of Malaysians will be over the age of 60, what alternative strategies are you going to propose in terms of funding national development without compromising on pension funds or retirement security? Howard?
Being the youngest one, can I start?
Sure.
An aging population is something that I care very much about. I probably am on the polar opposite of what Prof stand. I think the likes of Khazanah, the likes of EPF, the likes of any of the 6 Gear Up GLIC should be investing more, because as the nation gets more aged, there is, and we're also in the middle of a bit of a healthcare crisis, where you've got, essentially there is a direct correlation between people who are needing more care with the agingness or agedness of the population. And there's a direct correlation with the agedness of people needing care with the need for specific services like wound care, for example. So we've got an NCD crisis, diabetes on the up, so more people need wound care. A large percentage of treatment room episodes are on wound care. Now, why can't we invest? Why can't GLIC or any one of the group invest in an in-situ, in-home wound care so that you can bring down the bottlenecks that are in a clinic kesehatan?
But
Now,
investment
that needs
using
investment.
retirement funds.
Why not?
Specifically.
Tell me why not.
What are the alternative strategies?
But
Why
I
not,
think
Howard?
I
Because
think
EPF reports say 48% of members aged 54 have less than 50,000 ringgit in savings.
Absolutely, and you can even put the number up. I think it's about 7 million or something that has less than 10,000. And if we were to compound that with a factor of withdrawals during pandemic, etc., there is a higher need for higher returns some point somewhere along the line to make sure that there is enough money for future withdrawals or to bolster the portfolio. And I think I must say this one sentence: 10% high risk does not make the entire portfolio high risk.
That's right.
I think it's a different question, right? Because here we're talking about EPF's returns, and as far as I'm concerned, EPF has done fantastically well. Right? When in the 80s, EPF 90% of its assets was in government bonds. It could only invest in government bonds.
At
In the
this point of
90s,
time?
it started corporate bonds, and then started going into equities, and then we basically said, look, this returns in the long term is suboptimal. So then the government allowed EPF to invest overseas, right? And that lifted returns. If you look at recent performances, it's all because in the 90s we started investing overseas, right? And when you invest overseas, in some extent you take more risk also, right? You get currency risk, you get other risks. So EPF's performance has been good, right?
Okay.
The issue now about that you're concerned with is the savings of the rakyat, right? The issue there is basically a lot of withdrawals. Two is not enough people are covered under EPF. And ultimately it's because incomes are too low. We need to raise income.
Absolutely.
We need to grow
Absolutely.
faster. We need to raise incomes.
So then, is it justified for the government to use EPF money to invest? Is
No,
it justified based on the 3
No,
points?
I think it's a separate question. I mean, to me, there is no issue so long as EPF invests. If the EPF wants to invest more in Malaysia, so long as every investment goes through proper process, proper scrutiny, and it hits the targets in terms of the risk returns, that's good. I'm fine.
Prof.
When I started, I talked about a GLC ecosystem, which I said is huge. We're only talking about the 7 GLICs, and as Nazir pointed out, below them are many publicly listed companies. We can identify about 30. About a quarter of the market capitalization are by GLCs. They are major enterprises in the economy. Now, one good thing Anwar did say, and I applaud him for this, was he said, let's set the example by raising wages. And he talked about Khazanah. But I would go further. You own such a huge volume of enterprises, which employ a huge segment of employees also in the corporate sector. Why don't you start with them too? This comes back to the point about the mission drift. What exactly is the purpose of the GLC's government link up? They have a socio-economic dimension too, not just making profits. And if we understand that the GLCs can, being key players in the economy, employ a huge segment of the employees in the corporate sector, can play a role also by raising wages. We all agree we must raise wages. Set the example. Now, is the government moving in that way? This is where I am saying, look, we have a GLC ecosystem. We know it is deeply embedded in the economy. We know they employ a huge number of people. We know they are making profits. If you look at the top 10 companies, among the top 10 companies today in Malaysia, about 8 of them are GLCs. So why can't we use them as an example as to how we can talk about how to solve some of the problems with the aging population, about how we can raise their incomes so that they will have sufficient savings when they retire. But there's been no discussion on that score.
And so you say, is that a blind spot now? Because the question has not risen as to why now touch EPF money, but then Tan Sri, you said it's two separate issues. Are you in tandem with that?
Yes, they are. Honestly, they are separate issues. That's why we're putting many things on the table here today and we're discussing it. That's why I feel we need to look at it first from what is this ecosystem like? Who are
So
the
the ecosystem needs to be defined. There needs to be more transparency, more structure, and more professionals brought into the landscape, so to say.
Also, we talk mission drift. Let's just talk mission drift. What is the role of these institutions? Are we very
Defining the
clear
roles.
about these institutions?
Right.
How do they contribute to socioeconomic development? How much attention is also given? They have to generate profits. They are in part of the corporate sector. They have to pay dividends and so on and so forth, which also goes into PNB, institutions like PNB, which is all very important. But those are the issues which I feel we need to really get into and use them more productively and more responsibly to look after the well-being of an aging population too, which can then be an example for the other companies in the private sector too.
I'd like to jump in here by raising a negative thing because I sound
Really
like
quick,
I'm
Harvard, I've got
just-
30 seconds
yeah.
on the clock.
MHB, in the past, it's been too profit or short-term profit driven to the point that an airport in my constituency in Ipoh has not been developed or has not been allocated the money it needs to get to where it has to, where it needs to, where it can be right now. Because it was answering to the market, it was answering to the share market, it was answering to board members rather than answering to the needs of the country. Now, what the country and the government is now doing, that was a mission drift. Now, MHB now, Khazanah has taken back 70% of its share. So now it can do what the government needs it to do, as opposed to what it has not done in the last 10, 15 years. Perhaps with this, the government can instruct Khazanah, to go and invest in Ipoh Airport. Is that political intervention? I think it's a needed one.
A big question to be answered. We'll take a quick breather and be back with more discussion right here about risky ventures by the government. Is it safe to use the retirement fund for some of these investments? We'll be right back.
On the second day, we wanted to try the coffee at Arau Kopi. If you're a coffee lover, this place is a must try. The view here is insta-worthy and the food is just as good.
I guess maybe around 76.
60%?
I think around 74. Around 43%.
I am guessing 70%.
I would say maybe around 60%.
One is foundling. When the baby is found, which country do you want to deport the baby? Who is their parents? You just don't know. And in fatwa, right, it is in fatwa, every foundling who are found will automatically be a Muslim. Fatwa said that. But then you didn't give the child citizen. Dia nak pergi mana?
Hi there, you're watching Wacana, the English edition. The question tonight is, risky ventures. Is the government putting our savings at risk? Gentlemen, thanks for being with me here today. Now, we talked about reforms and transparency and needing to relook at roles and responsibilities of these entities, of the GLICs and the GICs. But what would you say are specific governance reforms that you could propose at this juncture to ensure that our funds are being used responsibly to achieve these national goals across sectors as in the Gear Up proposal? Tan Sri.
No, I mean, I think from a governance standpoint, as I said, what is most important is to make sure that the board and management and processes are right. Okay, so we need to look at how senior people are appointed, whether that process is correct, whether there's, in selecting chairmans and board members where there is political involvement or not, then I think in some cases we may also want to consider having some form of flexibility for parliamentary oversight. Yeah, here I think that you look at some of the projects in the past where they've gotten into trouble. The problem is when by the time we find out, the horse is bolted. So one could argue that in some of these projects, if they're really mega projects involving a lot of money, a lot of public money, etc., maybe there should be more frequency of Parliament kind of checking the details of these projects before they take off, before the money goes in.
Right.
As just another lens on what's going on. It's just a thought to put on the table.
So two checkpoints there, you say. Internal reforms and looking at
internal,
before
not
the
reforms.
horse
I'm just
bolts.
saying you just got to make sure that GLICs, GLCs are properly staffed with professionals, etc. Right, and people who stand up. And as I said, there is this moral hazard today that boards have gotten away with sort of saying I just took instructions.
Okay.
That's a moral hazard.
So then this also, in my opinion, begs the question, is there an immediate need for diversity of the kind of people who can sit and brainstorm and make decisions and take instructions and to come up with the ideas and, the best way forward rather than I took instructions approach, Prof?
Let's be clear. When we talk about these GLICs and GLCs, they straddle two worlds, the world of government or politics and the world of business. Now, that itself is not necessarily a good thing if, in the world of politics, these GLCs are ultimately controlled by the executive arm of government where there's no check and balance. Now, you said governance reforms. I like that. If we know it straddles two worlds, reforms are important. So let's talk, the government knows this, and let's talk about what the government has said they will do. One example, the Procurement Act. That's an important point. If we have a Procurement Act with oversight put in the arms of, say, the Parliament, then there can be a check and balance. Because when we are talking about these issues, they will fall under the procurement process.
Right.
That's just one example. Another example, the Political Financing Act. We've been talking about this for a very long time. And the reason I bring it up is because we know within the GLC ecosystem, the GLCs are primary funders for political activities. And it's not just at federal level, even at the state level they have a GLC ecosystem, and we know that GLC system has also been abused. A Political Financing Act will ensure that the GLCs are not abused by politicians at the federal or state level who control them. These are just two types of reforms which we've been talking about for a long time, which if they do introduce, will inspire investor confidence. And I want to close on this. Domestic investor confidence is not very high. This is one of the reasons why they are having the gear up policy. And if the reason they're having the gear up policy is to use the voluminous amount of funds within the arms of these different GLICs to push it into the economy to keep the economy going. The question that we should ask is, why is there not enough domestic investor confidence for them to want to invest in the economy, for the government to have to go down this route?
Howard, you're smiling.
In terms of DDI appetite, I don't want to go into sentiments. I don't want to talk about the hesitancy, whether it exists or not. I think the fact speaks for itself. Just this year, up until Q2 or end of Q2 and end of June, we're sitting at 85.4 billion approved. In 2023, it was 141.1 B. In 2020, it's 102.9. So it's an uptick. So let's not talk sentiment. Let's not talk hesitancy as though it is a sentiment, because it's not. Facts speak for itself. The hesitancy, it may not be full pelt, but it's definitely not hesitant. Investments are coming, DDI as well as FDI.
So you
That's
see you've
one.
got the facts and figures and you do not agree with what Prof has just
Absolutely
highlighted.
not, yes.
Nazir.
Sorry.
I'll come back to you, Nazir.
No.
And
Finish the point.
I also sit on a non-stipendiary position in the Invest Pair Up board. Investments are coming in. Maybe it's a pair up thing, but investments are coming in thick and fast, domestic and foreign in pair up. can't speak for others. And I think fundamentally in terms of gear up, look, we're talking about 120B in terms of DDI, another 40, that's by the 6 GLCs, and then you've got another 440B in cooperation with the private market over 5 years. I don't think it is a response to not enough DDI, so therefore they have to do it. I think it will be disingenuous for us to say that. But I think berkukuh behind it, as the project of the name, I think it is fundamentally to say that it is about crowding talent, crowding mechanisms. Of course, you've got strategic asset allocation principles, which is structural. You've got investment boards, you've got investment panels that go and vet through what how to adhere to the policy that's been set by MOF. And I have to stress here, MOF does not dictate specific investment decisions. And I think, Tan Sri, you can either agree or disagree with that. I think that is structurally sound as a thesis and as a theory and as a fact. So I think when you have the structural soundness of it, you've got this program that's trying to drive all the expertise and all the right people together, galvanizing expertise and talent together, galvanizing capital in this particular sense, and the appetite in DDI as well as FDI is definitely there. We just need to not ride it, but to leverage on it, to maximize it, and to capitalize on it, to build infrastructure. I think we're doing the right thing. It may not be perfect, but we're doing the right thing.
Tan Sri, don't be neutral now. Is it, are you leaning towards Harvard, or do you have your own perspective here?
No, I don't. To be honest, I would be surprised if the Gear Up program hits the target.
You would be surprised?
I would be surprised. Because I think in the end of the day, it's a number out there.
That's right.
They will have to kick the tires on every investment. But it's sending a tremendous signal to foreign investors and domestic investors that the government thinks it's a good time to invest. And I think the foreigners definitely have reacted very positively. And I think the locals I'm hearing also are back. Things are actually going well. This government actually is seeing a very good response to its policies. After initial hesitation, you can see it now. You can see it in the ringgit. You can see it in economic numbers. You can see it in the investment numbers. So actually, the response has been good. So in the end, if the GLICs don't need to invest 120 billion, I think there's no need if things are going well, right?
Having said that, do you think our discussion today has been moot from the beginning, because your opinion is that everything is going well and that as per planned, there has been some signs of improvement?
Not more discussion with these 2 hours, very good. But we have come up with some very important points, and if this is my last point, I just want to make this, which is that we must always remember that people change. Yeah, good people today can be bad people tomorrow. Right? Therefore, systems and processes are paramount.
Absolutely.
And my argument is that we have not reformed the system. So if we have a bad system, we could put good people there, right? While the good people remain good, or the good people are not changed, then it's okay. But one day, they become bad, or bad people go in, and the system is not reformed, we're going to go back, and problems are going to come again. Yeah, so this is, I think, the most important point we've come up with today. We all agree that we need to look at the system and make the structural changes so that we learn from bad lessons of the past and make sure that we have a robust system that will make sure that our savings are protected and the country is in good shape.
And if that's the point that we all agree on, then what is the starting point, Prof? Where do you suggest we begin this reforms?
Let's talk about the corporate sector, because this is really a discussion about what's going on in the corporate sector. Let's break down the corporate sector, because I want to counter the point that Howard just made. 98% of the corporate sector are SMEs. 98%. We have about 1.2 million companies. That would mean about 1 million companies are SMEs. What we are talking about here is that remaining 2%, the GLICs, the publicly listed firms, the family-owned enterprises, the large ones. My primary concern is that 98%. And to be fair to Anwar and when he talked about Gear Up, he said that this money should also go into helping bring the SMEs into the supply chains. Very good. He talked of MEFCAM, channeling money to these companies, these new startups. Very good. There's some interesting ideas here. I'm not here to critique this. I'm here to try and help the government improve on this. How much focus is there on that 98%? Now, when we talk about investor confidence, for me a key indicator is investments in R&D, because that's risky. That means the private sector is also willing to put their money in expensive R&D, which can go either way. The volume of R&D in this country is very low. It's also another indication of the lack of the risk appetite among our business people to go into R&D to help innovate, to move up the technological ladder.
Which is why GLICs need to come in.
Which is true. He's right. Which is where the GLICs come in and bring in that kind of investments in risky R&D. And they bring in the SMEs. That's the kind of partnerships I want to see. Bring in the SMEs into this process. Do the R&D for them. Then let them commercialize the new R&D. And then they can lift themselves up properly. But at the moment, the SME sector is not doing well. A majority of them are micro firms.
Right. We've spent an hour on this issue. May I take your closing statements, Tan Sri? I know you've nicely wrapped up your points, but if you could just provide us with some closing statements in about 2 or 3 sentences, Howard.
I think moving forward, this discussion isn't about figures or statistics. It's also only partially about institutions, but I think first and foremost is about trust. It's about trusting in the fact that the structures are there, the institutions are there, and the government has, I would say, an honest hunger to make it work. And in order for for the government to make it work, I think trusting in the process by the people goes a long way. And I think with that trust, I think with even a subpar program, it could bring superior results when the people trust in the government. And I hope that the government is doing enough to gain that trust. And once we've gained that trust, with the next 2 years, remainder of this term, it will be able to give us another 5 terms to really make us, the Malaysian economy, take off.
Trust the leaders, trust the government, Howard.
Trust the institutions.
Trust
Don't
the
care about the
institutions.
leaders.
Okay.
Trust in the institutions, trust in the idea of Malaysia, which involves all of it, including us.
Prof, your closing statement.
These institutions we are talking about, the GLICs and the GLCs, are very important institutions. They play an important role in this economy. We must appreciate that. And as we discussed, we can see how they can help lift the economy. Now, what the Anwar government is trying to do is to try to take these important institutions and help them play a role in lifting this economy. But, as we also said, the institutions responsible for lifting the economy must go through a major reform to ensure that checks and balances are in place, so that the point that you made, Howard, which is true, there's trust by the people in these institutions that when their funds are invested in the economy, it's done in good faith, after much discussion. And then probably we will see a lot more support for this. But at the moment, I'm hesitant to support this endeavor because the fundamental issue, the reforms, have not occurred yet. And yet we're investing so much money in these very institutions which are responsible for taking this money and investing it in the economy.
Tan Sri, your closing thoughts.
I thought I already closed, but anyway.
Please
No,
sum
I
it up
think
for
in
us.
the end of the day, it's been a very important discussion. I think we all somewhat landed in the same zone, that reforms are needed. But I'm more towards Howard's line that actually things are going well with this government. Initially, I was a bit skeptical, but now they seem to have put the right people in place. They put in good policies. Things are going well. But you remember I remember in the 1990s, things were going so well, but that was when the kind of seeds of the Asian financial crisis began. Yeah. So again, my point is, we do need those structural changes. Please, just because things are going well, do not take your eye off the ball that there are structural changes that this country needs.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much once again, gentlemen. It's been an interesting discussion. We'd like to thank our panelists tonight and, of course, our viewers for this very crucial conversation. Now, the discussion may end here, but the debate continues. When it's your retirement funds at stake, like your savings account, make sure you keep this topic, this conversation open, because 32 million Malaysians' retirement funds or futures remain on the line. Be sure to visit Sinar Daily's social media platform or the website www.sinardaily.my for more comprehensive news and coverage. I'm Jessie Chahal signing out for this time. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Take care.